A paper envelope slid across the diner counter. No stamp. No name. Just my brother's handwriting on the front. The waitress looked at me once, then looked away. Whoever had left it was already gone. Inside was a photocopy. A signature. A number I recognized. And a sentence highlighted in yellow. I read it twice. Then a third time. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, but I never touched it. By the time I stepped back outside, my phone was already vibrating in my pocket. It was him. Laughing before I even said hello. That's when I realized something was very wrong. My brother had called me the dumb one for so long that, for most of my life, it had stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like my role. He was the sharp one. The fast one. The one who knew contracts, bank forms, tax language, loan terms, and how to say complicated things in a way that made other people nod. I was the one who worked with my hands. I ran a small repair business. I fixed gates, rewired old houses, replaced broken ceiling fans, patched roofs when people needed them done cheap and quick. My days were simple. Up by 6. Black tea. Work van. A notebook on the passenger seat with addresses and materials written by hand. My brother liked to joke about that notebook. Still living in 2004, he'd say. Usually in front of other people. Usually smiling. People laughed because he laughed first. A few years earlier, after our mother's health started slipping, he naturally positioned himself as the one handling things. That was his phrase. He said it so often it became family language. Don't worry, he's handling things. Doctor visits. Bills. Insurance. Medication. The paperwork on the old family house. The small plot of land outside town our father had left behind. I believed him because, honestly, I wanted to. I was working 12-hour days then. My wife had just had our second child. My brother always spoke with the confidence of someone who expected to be trusted. And to be fair, at first, nothing looked wrong. If Mom needed groceries, they arrived. If a bill needed paying, he said it was paid. If I asked a question, he answered fast, with too much detail. Not enough to inform me. Just enough to tire me out. That was how he operated. He flooded the room with words until people mistook exhaustion for understanding. The first crack was small. Mom asked me one Thursday if I could pick up one of her prescriptions, because she said she'd been stretching the pills. I told her that couldn't be right. My brother had said her medication was being delivered monthly. She looked embarrassed when I said that. Then she told me maybe she had mixed it up. I almost let it go. A week later, I was replacing a water heater in a duplex across town when my brother called asking if I could transfer him money just for a couple of days because one of Mom's payments had come out early. He said the bank account was tied up in timing issues. He made it sound temporary. Technical. Normal. I sent it. That night, I checked my messages and realized he had asked for a couple of days' money 3 times in 2 months. Small amounts. Never enough to start a fight. Always enough to ignore if you were busy. Then I noticed something else. Whenever I visited Mom unexpectedly, he seemed irritated. Not angry. Just alert. Like I had walked into a room half a minute too early. He started answering questions I hadn't directed at him. If I asked Mom whether she wanted to visit my place for dinner, he'd answer that she was tired. If I asked whether she'd seen the specialist yet, he'd answer that the appointment had been moved. If I asked where certain property papers were, he'd laugh and say, "Relax. You wouldn't understand half of it anyway." That line used to sting. This time, I just remembered it. Then the envelope showed up. Inside was a photocopy of a transfer authorization form linked to our mother's care account. There was a signature that looked almost like hers. Almost. And beneath it, highlighted in yellow, were the words, "Secondary beneficiary update approved." My brother kept calling while I stood outside the diner, but I didn't answer. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel insulted. I felt awake. Because if somebody had risked sliding that envelope to me in public, they weren't guessing. They knew something. And if they knew something, there was more. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. I did not call him back that day. I drove straight to my mother's house after work, but I parked half a block away and waited. My brother's car was in the driveway. So was a white sedan I didn't recognize. At 6:12, a man in a grey jacket came out carrying a folder. He shook my brother's hand like this was business, not family, then left. My brother stayed on the porch for a moment, looking at his phone, then went back inside. I wrote down the plate number of the sedan. That was all I did. The next morning, I called my mother's pharmacy and asked a careful question. I told them I was trying to help organize her refill schedule because she had told me she was short on medication. The woman on the phone hesitated at first, then said she could only confirm limited information. What she confirmed was enough. 2 of the medications had not been picked up on time in the last 3 months. One had been switched to a lower refill frequency. That change had been authorized by the account contact on file. That account contact was not my mother. It was my brother. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called the county records office about the family property. I did not ask broad questions. I asked for copies. Anything filed in the last 12 months connected to my mother's name, the house, and the land outside town. There had been activity. A lot more than I expected. By late afternoon, I was holding printed records in my hand at a shipping store 3 blocks from my job site. Change of contact forms. A notarized authorization request. A beneficiary amendment tied to an account I did not even know existed. And one document that made me stop reading for a full minute. A limited power of attorney draft. Not fully executed. Not final. But prepared. And the signature line had been marked with pen tabs. I still did not confront him. Instead, I went back to the diner the next evening at the same time I had received the envelope. The same waitress was working. I ordered coffee and waited. She came over after 10 minutes, set the cup down, and said quietly, "You should check the back of the form." Then she walked away. I took the photocopy from my jacket and turned it over. There was a number written in blue ink. I stepped outside and called it. A woman answered on the second ring. She did not give her name. She just asked, "Did you get the copy?" I said yes. She told me she had worked temporarily in an office that processed account paperwork for elder care planning and estate updates. She said my brother had come in more than once with "your mother is tired" explanations and stacks of documents that were already signed. She said something about it felt wrong because the signatures varied too much. She had flagged one set internally, then been told to leave it alone. So she made copies before she quit. I asked her why she was helping me. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Because he said you were too stupid to notice." After that, she sent me 3 things. A voicemail recording from an office line where my brother can be heard asking whether the brother had to be notified if everything stayed under care management language. A scanned intake sheet listing him as sole family point of contact, even though my number had always been on file too. And a time-stamped security still from the office lobby showing my mother was not present on the day one of the documents was supposedly signed in person. That was the center of it. Not a rumor. Not a suspicion. Documents. A recording. A witness. A time-stamp. He had been shrinking my mother's world on paper while telling the rest of us he was protecting her. And the worst part was how ordinary it all looked. No dramatic fraud. No movie version of greed. Just forms. Controlled language. Administrative steps. Small changes layered quietly enough that nobody would notice until the structure was already in place. I printed everything twice. One set went into a folder in my van. The other went somewhere he would never think to look. Because by then, I understood the real risk was not what he had already done. It was what he would do if he realized I knew. Confronting them would have ruined everything. For the next week, I acted exactly the same. Same routine. Same work calls. Same short conversations with my brother when he phoned. If anything, I became easier. When he joked about my notebook again, I laughed. When he mentioned how complicated Mom's financial side had become, I nodded like I didn't understand any of it. The less I reacted, the more comfortable he seemed. Meanwhile, I started organizing what I had. The recording from the office line was saved in 4 places. My laptop, an encrypted drive, a cloud backup, and a copy sent to someone who didn't even know my brother's name. The documents were scanned at high resolution, each one labeled with date, location, and source. I made sure nothing looked tampered with. Every copy matched the original exactly. I learned something during those nights at my kitchen table. Paper tells stories if you line it up properly. The beneficiary change appeared 2 days after a doctor's visit my brother had insisted on attending alone. The pharmacy adjustments appeared a week later. The limited power of attorney draft appeared 3 weeks after that. Each step moved in the same direction. Less access for my mother. More control for him. But the real weakness in his plan was confidence. He assumed 2 things were true. First, that I would never notice the paperwork. Second, that even if I did, I wouldn't know what to do with it. Both assumptions were wrong. I called an attorney the following Monday morning. Not someone flashy. Not someone who advertised on billboards. Just a quiet estate lawyer recommended by a contractor client of mine years ago. I told him I had concerns about documentation related to Elder Care Authority and possible unauthorized financial restructuring. He asked me to bring everything. When I spread the copies across his conference table, he didn't interrupt. He just read. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked one question. "Has your mother signed anything in front of you recently?" I told him no. He nodded once. Then he explained something calmly that my brother had clearly not expected. Certain documents tied to care authority and beneficiary changes require verifiable conditions. Witnessing standards. Notary verification. Identity confirmation. If those steps are bypassed or misrepresented, the documents don't just become questionable. They become dangerous. Not for the victim. For the person who submitted them. The attorney contacted 2 offices that same afternoon. Quietly. No accusations. Just requests for procedural verification tied to specific file numbers. By Wednesday morning, we had confirmation that one of the notarizations listed on the forms had never been logged in the official record. By Thursday afternoon, the Care Management Office requested an internal review of the paperwork my brother had submitted. And by Friday, a social services case officer scheduled a visit with my mother. I still said nothing to him. Friday evening he called me while I was finishing a repair job on a porch railing. "Mom seems a little confused lately," he said casually. "I might need to step in more officially soon." I told him that made sense. He sounded relieved. That weekend, he invited me over for dinner like everything was normal. He talked about a vacation he was planning once the paperwork side was finalized. He spoke the way people do when they believe the future is already secured. Monday morning, 2 cars parked outside my mother's house. One belonged to the social services officer. The other belonged to the attorney. My brother arrived 15 minutes later, holding a folder under his arm. He waved at me from the driveway like nothing had changed. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. The morning was quiet. Cool air. A slow breeze moving through the trees near the driveway. I arrived a few minutes before the others and sat in my van, watching the house the way I had watched it many evenings before. The front curtains were open. My mother was inside, moving slowly between the kitchen and the living room. At 9:02, the first car pulled in. The social services officer stepped out with a tablet and a thin folder. She knocked gently and introduced herself to my mother before walking inside. My brother's car arrived a few minutes later. He stepped out smiling, coffee in one hand, a leather folder under his arm. When he saw me leaning against the van, he raised an eyebrow. "Look at that," he said. "The busy man shows up early." I shrugged. "Work started late today." He nodded, casual, comfortable. He had no idea. A third car pulled up at 9:12. The attorney stepped out carrying a slim briefcase and walked directly toward us. My brother recognized immediately that this wasn't routine anymore. His smile faded just slightly, the way it does when someone feels the floor shift beneath them but hasn't decided whether to panic. "Can I help you?" he asked. The attorney introduced himself politely and asked if we could all speak inside. My brother tried to laugh it off. "What's this about?" The attorney didn't answer directly. He just said it would be better to discuss it with everyone present. Inside, the social services officer was already sitting at the kitchen table with my mother. She had a gentle tone, asking small questions about medications, recent appointments, and whether anyone had helped her with paperwork recently. My brother stepped in quickly. "I've been coordinating most of that," he said. The officer nodded and wrote something down. Then the attorney placed a small stack of papers on the table. Photocopies. The same ones I had spent nights organizing. My brother looked at them once, then again. The room stayed calm. No raised voices. The attorney began explaining slowly. He referenced verification records, notary logs, and the documentation submitted under my brother's name. He pointed to the beneficiary amendment. Then the care account contact update. Then the limited power of attorney draft. Each document had one problem. Verification gaps. Signatures recorded without confirmed presence. A notary record that did not exist in the state database. The social services officer asked my mother a simple question. "Do you remember signing these forms?" She looked at them for a long moment. Then she shook her head. My brother tried to interrupt. There must be some mistake. But the attorney slid one more item forward. A transcript of the voicemail recording. The room stayed quiet as he read the line where my brother had asked whether the brother needed to be notified. My brother didn't speak after that. The officer explained the next steps carefully. The documents would be frozen pending investigation. Financial authority would revert temporarily until the review was completed. Any unauthorized changes would be reversed. No accusations. Just procedure. The kind that leaves a paper trail. My brother looked at me then. Not angry. Just confused. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what role I was playing. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The evidence had already done the talking. Within weeks, the beneficiary changes were cancelled. The care account authority returned to joint oversight. The property filings he had attempted were flagged and blocked. More importantly, my mother's records were corrected. Her medications were restored to the proper schedule. Her accounts were monitored by people who actually checked the signatures. My brother stopped calling as often after that. The jokes about me being the dumb one disappeared. Not because I argued. Because there was nothing left to argue about. A few months later, I visited my mother on a quiet evening. She was sitting in the living room knitting slowly, the television murmuring in the background. I made tea. We didn't talk about paperwork. We talked about ordinary things. The kids. The garden. The neighbor's dog that kept digging holes near the fence. Before I left, she looked at me and said softly, "I'm glad you've been around more." I told her I wasn't going anywhere. When I stepped outside, the air had cooled and the street was empty. No phone calls. No envelopes. No quiet tension sitting behind every conversation. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees. That night, everything was quiet.